This year's anticipated OnePlus release goes up against a comeback story for Samsung. This is Joshua Vergara, what's going on everybody? And this is a quick look at the OnePlus 5 versus the Samsung Galaxy S8. He's completed his full review of the OnePlus 5, so make sure to check it out in the card and in the description below. For now, however, I will be bringing you some quick rundowns between the OnePlus 5 and a couple of its competitors, with fuller comparisons to come later. Users of the Galaxy S8 will probably point to its design as the best part of the phone. The infinity display is definitely a sight to behold, not just because of its curved sides that allow for easier handling, but also because it is nearly free of bezel. The result has been an enjoyable 18.5 to 9 ratio display at Quad HD resolution that looks good in its skin. And though the home button might have gone away, it does get an extra input, the Bixby button. Speaking of extra inputs, OnePlus returns its highly tactile and useful alert slider to the OnePlus 5 in a body that is slightly different from before and has its own share of controversy. We won't go as far to say that the OnePlus 5 looks very much like the iPhone 7, but we do recognize a couple of the cues that it took from an iOS competitor, mainly the antenna lines and of course the dual camera. Up front, the phone is still decidedly OnePlus with a capacitive array that includes a home button and fingerprint combo underneath the 1080p display. The display puts the Galaxy S8 above the OnePlus in the handling department, but also on paper it is the higher powered panel. The S8 display is already bigger than the 5.5-inch flat panel on the OnePlus, but the OnePlus 5 still rocks the AMOLED 1080p display well. In terms of features, there are a number of swipes and gestures that can be done in standby to fire up the camera and other shortcuts. One of my favorites, however, is the reading mode. Basically, like a Kindle, it will desaturate the display to make it more comfortable for reading. As a Kindle user, I will be testing this feature further against the e-reader, but I already enjoyed switching to the reading mode for longer sessions. It's nice to have on the OnePlus 5, since it doesn't support a couple of the more useful Samsung display features like the Edge UX or the always-on display. Under the hood, power is definitely not wanting, as the Snapdragon 835 powers either of these phones, and the latest Exynos makes an appearance depending on your market for Samsung. Despite its global reach, OnePlus is actually taking a page out of an increasingly common Chinese phone spec book by giving not only more than 4GB of RAM, but super high capacity storage. The highest spec phone of the bunch will have 8GB of RAM and 128GB of storage for a price that is less than either of the Galaxy S8 phones. And of course, it all powers the different pieces of software for either phone. Samsung's UX has definitely slimmed down in more recent iterations, and it is still the feature-rich and sometimes redundant user experience that can get bogged down by its own capabilities. Samsung apps accompany the already existing Google app ecosystem, for example, with Bixby and Samsung Notes sitting right alongside Google Assistant and Google Drive applications. For our full versus in the future, we'll be looking at the updates to Bixby, in which voice input and better vision recognition are part of the menu. On the other hand, Oxygen OS reaches its latest edition and brings Nougat-like look and feel, but also some of OnePlus's own flavors. The shelf returns and is still a nice place to put one's widgets so that they're out of the way, and we mentioned the gestures and display features from before. There isn't too much else to this updated version that is overtly different, but that might play to the strength of the underdog competitor. After all, we are proponents of buying phones that have the features we will definitely use, instead of the features we will never touch after the initial setup. Which finally brings us to the camera. As I mentioned before, a fuller versus comparison will happen, and that will include picture analysis. For now, we will highlight the fact that the Galaxy S8 is one of the flagships this year that is missing the increasingly key addition, a secondary camera. The OnePlus 5 manages to tuck a 20-megapixel 2x zoom telephoto lens right next to its 16-megapixel main shooter in order to bring its own version of zoom and portrait mode to Android masses. The result is a picture experience that remains very familiar to previous software, meaning that swipes and minimal presses on the viewfinder are par for the course. We really like the manual Pro mode, however, which uses a toggle for raw capture and even includes a histogram. Portrait mode is sure to be a hit among OnePlus 5 users, as the combination of zoom, high-resolution capture, and software bokeh effects will make capturing new profile pictures pretty damn easy. Compare this to the Samsung camera, which is a fixed 12-megapixel dual-pixel camera that is similar to last year's well-received shooters from the S7 and the Note 7. There is little to complain about for good point-and-shoot capabilities, though Samsung makes sure to put in a bunch of features and its own Pro mode. The front-facing camera here is one of the only shooters to include autofocus, but then again, OnePlus is trying to up the selfie game by making their front-facing shooter a whopping 16-megapixel monster. Again, we will be making comparisons in our upcoming versus pitting these two camera combos against one another. And with that, we hope that you got a quick but good glance at what these two phones have to offer. The OnePlus 5 is available for a lesser price outright, making it the appealing choice for anyone that wants to go outside the typical flagship spectrum. Especially after Bixby finally properly arrives, we will have a needed more in-depth look at these phones soon.